Welcome to Code the Future, the podcast where we explore the technology that's shaping tomorrow's mobility. Today I'm speaking with Ian Richards, VP of Global Automotive Practices at TechInsights. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Very pleased to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And I know that you've been with TechInsights for over 27 years, so if you'll indulge me, or is it more?
It'll be 30 years in March.
30 years.
So a big round zero coming up at the end, which is a bit scary.
So if you'll indulge me, I want to take a walk down memory lane and go back to
I love that.
1996 when you started. In 1996, the average new car cost about $15,000 USD.
Yep.
So that's about $28,000 in today's dollars. The Toyota Camry was America's best-selling vehicle. Yep. EVs were virtually non-existent. Software played virtually no part in vehicle design. And now if we fast forward 30 years, EVs are 20% of the global marketplace. The average new car is $50K, and software is the beating heart of every vehicle.
And my hair's a very different color.
And your hair is a very different color. It's safe to say that you've seen a lot of changes over the past year. So it's good to have you on here so you can speak to us a little bit about, where we're headed next, right?
Thank you.
So, good stuff. So, I mean, it's obviously been a challenging year to be an automaker.
Absolutely.
A lot of gray hairs, I'm sure, on some of those CEOs.
Lack of hairs.
If you were to sum it up, write the headline for the year that was to the automotive industry.
Geopolitical pressures. I think that's the big one. We'll talk about the technology later, but this is the toughest one. And the sheer number of them, and it's like one after the other. We've got ones rumbling on, It's strange, beginning of the year I was talking about nothing but tariffs. No one's asked about tariffs recently because there's so much more to worry about.
Sure, yeah.
We've had the whole Nexperia crisis with chips becoming unobtainable again. And do we redesign? Do we wait? What do we do? And these are the things there's no easy answer to, especially with automotive lead times, because now we're in a memory crisis.
Mm-hmm.
How long is that going to last? I could redesign for different types of memory. I could look at mitigations. That's going to cost a lot.
Yeah.
And it might fix itself, but it might not. So what on earth do I do?
Yeah.
It's great for analysts because if everything was certain, we wouldn't be needed.
Yeah.
But it's those sorts of things. And then we have probably the most tumultuous, rapid period of change that there's ever been since I've been an analyst with the whole SDV revolution, which I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Definitely,
interesting times.
Yeah. Well, may you always live in interesting times. That's what they say,
absolutely.
Right?
That's why.
Probably see more change over the next 10 than we've seen in the previous 100, right?
It could well be. Well be.
So, I mean, you're speaking to a lot of OEMs, either your clients, customers.
Indeed.
What is top of mind for them? What are they looking for your perspective on?
There have been some of the geopolitical factors and are taking on that, particularly on the supply side of semiconductors, because I think that's what they realized during the COVID crisis. I was talking to one OEM, premium-ish OEM, who said he could, and this was the quote, he essentially knew which field in Switzerland the cow grew up that provided the leather for his seats.
Amazing.
Because that supply chain. But some of his semiconductors just kind of arrived on a truck.
Wow.
And they had no visibility. And that some mitigation we put in place. We're finding that again with things going on now, that whole security of supply chain is a real problem, because without that, you just can't plan. You just can't plan. And then it is everything to do with the software-defined vehicle revolution. And the thing I try and make my customers understand, and most of them get it, there's two revolutions in one. There's a technological revolution, which all of them understand, but there's an organizational revolution as well. Because the old style company that you were cannot integrate a software-defined vehicle because you are set up in the same siloed structures that the vehicle was, almost certainly. So we've had to re-architect our own core processes and businesses in the way that we go to market, the way that we design our models. And every automotive company is having to do the same thing, putting in horizontal layers of cross-domain communication, all that sort of thing. So it's an organizational as well as a technological challenge.
Yeah, no small task, right? And it's like trying to turn, I shouldn't say turn around the Titanic, but it's like trying to turn around a massive...
Let's not go with the Titanic. No. That ended badly. But
so how would you sum up then where we are as an industry when it comes to the recognition of those two challenges? Where are we on that journey?
I think we've been in a dark place by and large on average. I think there's light at the end of the tunnel, and I think there's a good chance it's not an oncoming train. And So I say I'm starting to see the first signs, your own announcements at the show, including things like Alloy Core, of sort of, platforms being put in place where not everyone is having to reinvent the same stuff that isn't really differentiating. So that at a range of different levels from different vendors, this sort of more cohesive platform approach is starting to come forward. Some degrees of commonality, some shared approaches, but at the moment it's still the Wild West. That's the biggest challenge I get from tier 1 vendors, tier 2 vendors, is the sheer complexity of the landscape, and what I'm doing for customer A has absolutely no relevance to customer B because they're doing something completely different. I was talking to one semiconductor vendor the other day, one of the latest products, 32 SKUs for that product to cover it's just like, whoa.
So much for simplification.
Absolutely.
So do you think given the complexity, do you think industry-wide standards will emerge, or will we continue to see sort of proprietary approaches when it comes to architectures?
Yes to both. And for the foreseeable future, it's going to be, I think it's going to be a long process, with some moving faster than others in that direction. There are some who've taken their own approach and done it quite well, and so they're likely to stick with it, and perhaps will only might jump to more standards-based approaches when they become really robust, and there's a real good reason to do that. Others who perhaps haven't been quite so successful in their own approaches might jump for the standards-based solutions earlier as a sort of reset point. And we've seen a few reset points happen already at various car makers. And I think there's likely to be a few more in the coming 12, 24 months.
Okay. What about the contrarian approaches that are being taken out there? I'm thinking, I guess, of someone like Slate Auto. Some that are sort of bucking the entire trend, going in a different direction.
That's really interesting. We may see more of that as well. I mean, you mentioned in the intro, a car back in 1996, $15,000 was $28,000.
Cost of living ain't cheap.
I think there is a gap in the market globally for something a bit simpler that doesn't, that gives you all you need, but doesn't necessarily give you what you don't need.
We need ChatGPT in the car.
Everything has got incredibly complicated now. And I always used to scoff, as a younger man, I always used to scoff, but I'm now getting to that grumpy old man stage of life where, just after things, recently, last few years, I have to wear varifocals. Touchscreens don't work really nearly as well when you're doing this the whole time. It's all sorts of pain points which perhaps the industry isn't addressing perfectly at the moment, whereas a simpler approach can sometimes be better. So they're good. I also quite like what Rivian's doing. And I'm really impressed with the fact that for a relatively young company, they're on their second gen of architecture already, and moving in they've got a very clear vision of where they're going at a very different point in the market, but they seem to be able to make it work at the moment.
And potentially being able to license it to other OEMs.
Well, that's
in
it.
The future,
they've got those partnerships out there already. So
Do you think there's lessons that the auto industry can learn from other sectors when it comes to sort of this inflection point that they're at, whether it's aerospace or consumer electronics or?
I think that's really tricky. Because it's always the complaint in one sense of automakers that they're essentially making a consumer product or a consumer price product to aerospace quality. And so those two ends, there's nothing in the consumer market with the complexity of a car. And very little that's potentially as dangerous as the car if it goes wrong. And on the other hand, actually a plane architecturally, although it's a much bigger device in terms of the compute power, it's the car's up there with it, so it's not necessarily too much to learn there. The thing that's particularly emerged at this show where we might see some better synergies going forward is automotive and robotics. Particularly the humanoid robots we're seeing so many of at this show, and particularly when we talk about automotive, the automated driving challenges, because essentially they're solving the same problem. It's like understanding the world and then reacting accordingly if you boil it down to the very bare basis. And I think there's some real opportunities there. It's not like one's in the lead necessarily. It's a sort of simultaneous advance and co-learning between those two fields, and there's plenty of players in both fields that are starting to make that happen as well as some interesting announcements from the likes of Mobileye this week.
That's right. And Hyundai, and it definitely seems like two worlds are colliding.
That's it. NVIDIA has basically the same platform going across both, so a lot happening there.
And when you think about next generation vehicle architectures and the decisions that are being made today, I mean, we know you make a decision now, the vehicle's not going to be out on the road for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Is the die being cast to a certain extent? Like, is this, do you foresee industry consolidation based on some of the decisions that are being made today?
I
or
think,
is it too early to tell?
I think yes, particularly in China. Relative to the size of the market, there are too many independent car makers in China. politically, that's a challenge in terms of consolidation. Very different economy to that which we're used to in the West.
Yeah.
But I think there has to be some degree of consolidation. The other big change I potentially see, and what I'm really keeping an eye on, is Foxconn.
Okay.
I mean, a similar concept to Slate in terms of
Sure.
the skateboard,
Yeah.
but the idea of the built-to-print car or the white label car. And I mean, we've talked for years about the Apple car.
Yeah, and then it went kaput.
And then it went.
Yeah.
When we were talking about that, my vision of how an Apple car or a name other big tech brand, whatever car might come to market, is essentially as a white label device where you bring the recognizable elements of your IP and is the customization on an essentially standardized product.
Yeah.
In the same way as we see it in large parts of the cell phone market.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really big thing. And the other thing I expecting to see perhaps in certain elements of the OEM market is a bit more differentiation between IP and manufacturing. Because there are some hugely vertically integrated organizations like BYD which are doing well.
Yep.
But by and large, it's hard to do both really, really well in the same organization. And it's separating out that sort of, next generation technologies, keeping on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
And being able to manufacture well sometimes pulls companies in different directions, I think. And just as in, I'll go back to the cell phone market again, some of the leading vendors of the likes of Apple's essentially an IP company, Foxconn
That's right.
is his manufacturing partner. And I think, again, that could be a model for how some automotive goes in the future. Brands which have value can carry going on that way. There are some brands today which might not have enough value to survive.
Yeah, okay. What about the regulatory burden, right? I mean, we saw recently they chose to postpone the Senate Commerce Committee that was going to be calling to task the CEOs of the big three around increased regulations, in-car mandated tech. Do you see that, improving over time or worsening when it comes to the various regulations that the OEs have to?
I don't think so. I think what the OEM's really crying out for is some degree of stability. We're not in a very stable political environment in general at the moment, not looking anywhere in particular. But it's just, if you know and are able to plan, that's fine. But when incentives are going on, coming off, etc., you're getting pulled this way, pulled that way, that's really, really difficult for a relatively long cycle industry like automotive.
Yeah, where you haven't hit the big bets and stick with them for a long time.
And it's that interaction of regulation actually with the end user, with the driver, because one of the other big disappointments I might see over the last sort of 5-ish years or more is that the number of drivers, myself included, and maybe you, I won't ask you to volunteer, the first thing they do when they get in the car is turn off half the ADAS systems because they're so damn annoying.
Yes, I've been there. Yeah.
That's an industry failure. So it's mandated tech that I turn off.
Yeah.
That makes sense to no one because I've paid for something that I actively avoid using.
Yeah, and you see it in the JD Power rankings.
You see it in the JD
every year,
Power
and I think they've made some marginal gains, like as an industry, but it's still
so like the likes of Euro NCAP is responding now. They're saying in the future they're not just going to be looking at the bold performance figures, but actually the usability of the system, because they've realised that what's the point in a car that's hugely safe theoretically if no one actually has the system turned on because they hate it.
Right. No, it's complicated for sure, right? We've all been there. Is there a topic that you think, when you reflect back on the year that was, that didn't necessarily get as much attention as you thought it should? And, I guess, do you think that might change in the future? Is there one?
I don't know. I'm going to stick with what I've just been talking about. I think through all the technological change and the geopolitical pressures, some aspects of the industry are in danger in losing sight of the consumer. And that's the one thing that I haven't talked about much this year, is actually the voice of the consumer. What do they actually want? What do they actually need? How are we going to do that? With any technological change, the danger is particularly for engineering-led industries. And I say this as someone who's trained as an engineer themselves. The engineers take charge. And do all sorts of fantastic stuff that no one asked for.
Right. And it's amazing, but...
And then you've got mandates pulling again people in certain directions. And again, depending on the type of OEM you are, the easy thing is to just fulfill the mandate, but forget about the impact on the customer. So for 2026, I'd love to see a refocus on true customer needs, how to delight the customer as the starting point to generating that additional revenue that the SDV has promised. Because sometimes it's getting the cart before the horse sometimes.
Sure.
In that people can see those additional revenues, those potential applications, but are forgetting that the customer actually has to like them and want them for that to work.
Yeah. No small task.
No small task at all.
So when you mentioned your engineering background, and I guess when you're thinking about, the industry 10, 20, 30 years from now, what do you think those critical skill sets will be that will, separate one OEM from another? Or
I don't know, one OEM from another, but maybe one worker from another or something.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge already today and over the next couple of years is how to integrate AI into your workflow, and the skill set of knowing what tasks the human needs to do and what tasks the AI needs to do, and how to bring those two together. That's really, really, really important. And at the same time, I think that perhaps there's been a lack of focus on the softer, and I say this as a man of a certain age, on the softer skill sets of actually interpersonal relationships. Maybe it's a very personal reflection. I found the COVID period quite difficult, not being able to get out there and meet customers. I mean, this sort of chat, this bouncing off of ideas is what I live and breathe for, and I think that drives a lot of true innovation.
Definitely.
And the thought that might be, one day it might be, my AI email inbox talking to your AI email inbox.
What does it come to? Why are we here?
Exactly. So that combination of knowing when to use AI, how to leverage it, but also keeping the very real human aspects of business life, and all those soft skills around it in terms of, actually getting up and talking to the person at the desk next to you rather than IMing them, even though they're only over there.
Yeah, no, it could be a lost art, and hopefully it doesn't get to that.
As I say, I might just be a man of a certain age on that one.
Yeah, no, we're cut from the same cloth when it comes to that. Just wrapping up, always our final question is, again, you've been in the industry a long time. If you could go back to that younger Ian, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to, make a difference in the auto industry, what piece of advice would you give your younger self, knowing what you know now?
I think the best advice is, if ever anyone says to you, any questions? Ask a question. Ask 2 questions. Ask 3 questions.
Show that you're keen and curious.
Show that you're keen. And curious. I mean, risk quoting Ted Lasso, be more curious. That idea of, always keeping your mind open to new ideas, always seeking to understand, not just receive information.
Sure.
Maybe it's the analyst brain of partly who I am again, and I've done some of that, but I'm sure I could have done more. And that's what I try and instill in junior analysts when they come into the company. It's this sense of, you think you know this, but the more questions you ask, the quicker you'll become an expert yourself.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I've learned a lot from you just chatting with you for the past 20 minutes. So it's been great, and we'll definitely have you back on.
Well, so thanks so
much. See how things have changed,
Absolutely. Okay. Same time, same place. A few years.
Love it.